I have a focal MC Auto 28mm 2.8 lens here that I'm going to be disassembling. This is a Minolta mount lens, and it uses some cheaper materials, but it's surprisingly easy to actually take apart. Because of how it's constructed internally, though, you do have to be careful not to strip the screws, but you can actually disassemble this lens almost more easily than you can the Minolta one, the Minolta 28mm lens. I'm going to be fully disassembling this lens to get access to the optics, diaphragm, mechanical sections on the inside, and most of the body sections on their own as well. So to start off here on this lens, looking here at the front, you'll notice it has no name ring or anything, and this is common on cheaper lenses where they'd put like the name ring or whatever insignias on the outside of the lens barrel or somewhere else on the lens rather than have a name ring. So here we have this ring going around the top, which is also what the filters would normally screw into, and this just unscrews on its own. So grip it on the outside and this entire thing unscrews. Alright, so there's that ring. Now we've exposed the next ring here, which is actually containing the optics. So we have the intersection with the optics down here and then the focusing ring going around on the outside. And the intersection has two little divots for a spanning wrench on either side. Alright, so now we've removed the entire front optic. You can see that this housing is it's like a big plastic housing, so you can't actually disassemble this front optic piece, at least as far as I'm aware. You can't take it apart any further and clean inside, which is also more common on the cheaper lenses as well. And now we've exposed the front of the diaphragm here. So looking in, see the front of the diaphragm, like on 28mm lenses, commonly it's pretty small, so it's not something that I'd recommend taking apart when we actually get to that stage later, but you can clean it in this stage fairly easily. Now flipping over the lens, looking here at the back section, we have the mounting plate going around here, the silver section with the mount. So it has three screws going in here, here, and here. They will undo to just lift off the entire mounting plate. And now this mounting plate should just slide off. It can be a little bit difficult to remove just because of how things are coupling in. Looking at the mounting plate on the back section, you can see it has like 100 little ball bearings going around here and the outside. So this is not something you can really take apart any further, but that's actually providing the smooth motion of the lever. I don't know why they need quite as many ball bearings as they have there, but put that aside for now. Now we have the aperture control ring down on this level here going around on the outside, and then the center section with the optic. And you'll see that the optic has two sets of little holes for a pointed tip spanning wrench. There's one on this upper level here right next to the optic, and then there's one on the lower level. And the lower level one is actually what removes the entire back optical piece. So with a pointed tip spanning wrench here, go in and remove the lower level one to remove the entire back optic. The upper level one allows you to actually disassemble the optic further, and I'll point that out in a second. Alright, so there's the entire back optic, and what that upper level one allows you to do is you can actually disassemble this back optical piece a little. There's some adhesive in here, I believe, but you can actually, with a pointed tip spanning wrench, go in and undo the top section here and remove the first of the back elements. And then on the inside here, you can also undo this section here. Again, you can kind of see the adhesive over here on this side over here. And you can undo this with a pointed tip spanning wrench or a screwdriver, and you can clean inside of there. Looking here at the back of the lens, next up we have the aperture control ring in here, and then there's this little intersection which also rotates as I move this around. So this is actually a separate ring in here with the little silver post that's coupling it in, so we can remove this right now. So this is just coupling in the aperture control ring into the diaphragm, a very simple setup. I'll talk about how everything's getting coupled in on the reassembly. And now we try to lift off the aperture control ring here. It's still stuck in place, and what's holding it in place are these two little silver sections over here. And these are actually adjustments that allow you to control how far the aperture opens and closes. So at either extreme, these little adjusters are hitting up against sides of the aperture control ring and limiting how far you can turn in either direction. So we have to undo these to actually remove the aperture control ring. So we'll remove the two screws for each of these pieces here and just remove those little bars. Okay, now that we've removed the two bars over here, we can lift the aperture control ring off. The one thing you have to be careful of is that over on this side, opposite of this little silver lever, there's the ball bearing, which provides the clicking sound and locks things in place. So I'm just going to be careful lifting this off so I don't lose the ball bearing. All right, so there's the ball bearing right there. And then the aperture control ring itself. This is just a plastic ring going around. So you can clean this on its own because it doesn't have any mechanical sections anymore. And now looking at the back of the lens, we have the next level, which is the one with the depth of field scale here on it. And that one has these different components extending back that the aperture control ring was actually sitting on. So this black body section here. So this one is coupled into the lens by 4 black screws going around on the lower lip here. So we'll undo those 4 and then remove that back body section. Alright, so there's that back body section. I will say that this lens, at least my copy, was incredibly oily inside, and there was some oil on the diaphragm when I initially got it. So you can kind of still see it. I've already cleaned it out partially, but there's still quite a bit of oil in here. So if you have a copy, it's probably likely that it has some oil or something on the diaphragm, or at least close to it. Now we have the actual back of the diaphragm assembly completely exposed, and then the back of the focusing ring here. So this entire focusing ring is what you see on the outside of the lens going in here. That's all exposed in the back section here now. And it's very easy to actually fully remove the diaphragm, which is a very nice feature of this lens. So the diaphragm is held in place here, this whole black section. It's held in place by the 3 little screws down on the lower section here. So we'll undo these 3. Now the entire diaphragm assembly just lifts right out like that. And we have the focusing ring over on its own as well. So just looking at the diaphragm for a second here, I'm not actually going to disassemble the diaphragm on this one, but this is a pretty good state where you can clean it off pretty well. Looking at this diaphragm, there are 2 levers on it. There's this silver lever over here, and that is what the aperture control ring is coupling into. So normally when I move this about, nothing's happening, but when I press this other black lever down over on this side, that actually is depressing the lens. And if I hold that down and then move the aperture control ring lever back and forth, you can see the lens opening and closing. So normally the operation of this lens is that the black lever is held open in this position by a spring, so it's holding the diaphragm closed fully. And then the aperture control ring lever rotates back and forth, which opens and closes the diaphragm. And then when you hit the stop down lever, this lever springs back to its normal state and fully opens up the lens. To actually disassemble the diaphragm, you can remove the back plate here. You can see that these 3 screws have a little bit of adhesive around them, but it's easy enough to actually remove these. And then once you remove this back plate, you can remove the blades of the diaphragm as well. So the blades are right behind here, and they're going into the 6 little holes going around here. The blades on this one are small, so it's a little bit harder to put back together than the 50mm lenses, but it's not incredibly small, so it is possible to do so. And you can just reassemble it pretty easily back inside, going in from the back here once you clean off the blades individually. And then looking at this focusing mechanism again, the other one component that you can take off here is to actually remove the focusing ring from the focusing mechanism. So if you want to, for example, clean just the focusing ring and not worry about getting moisture inside the focusing mechanism here, you can actually remove that focusing ring by undoing the 3 little black screws down in this ring here. The downside of that is that once you undo these screws, you have to zero the lens again or make markings when you undo this so that you can line everything up properly, and that the lens indicates that you're focused at infinity when it's optically focused at infinity. So I'm not going to do it here, but it's easy enough to just disassemble that and clean it off on its own. So that has the entire disassembly of this lens complete. You can see it's not too complex. You've got the optics here, the back optic, which can be further disassembled, and then the front optic, which you actually can further disassemble. I was just mistaken before. Looking at the front optic here, this top cap can actually be removed from the rest of it, and then I'm assuming that there's little caps under it that you can then remove to remove the individual optics and elements of this piece. So this one is disassemblable. You can disassemble this one as well. And we also have all the mechanical sections, and most of the mechanical sections are actually on the diaphragm itself. It's a very simple mechanical setup. which is actually coupling everything into the aperture control ring. And then of course we have the body sections mostly separate as well. So starting here on the reassembly, first off, grab the focusing mechanism here. I'm going to focus it over so that it's indicating infinity, and that's just a good point to have it set at. And I'll grab the diaphragm first. So on the diaphragm here, it has the two sides, the one with the 2 screw holes, and that one lines up with the 2 screw holes and the post going along here. So this just will go like that, and then reattach with the 3 little black screws going around here, here, and here. And when reattaching these screws, you do have to be careful in some pieces not to tighten them too much or else they can strip. That's especially a problem when they're screwing into things like this black body section here, the focusing mechanism. When they're screwing into these type of screw holes, it's easy to strip the screws. So next up, we'll reattach that body section. And this one has to be lined up properly. It has the 4 screw holes going around it. But we want it lined up so that you can see that the black body section here has a larger gap over on this side. And that's actually what the coupling of the aperture control ring to the diaphragm will be going through. That has to line up with the side of the diaphragm that has the little silver lever. And that's what's going to be controlling, or that's what the aperture control ring controls directly. So we'll find the 4 screw holes that line up in that orientation and then reattach those 4. Next up we have 2 components. One is this silver ring, which is actually doing the coupling of the aperture control ring to the diaphragm, and then the other is the aperture control ring itself. So the best way to do this, there's a few things that have to line up. So the aperture control ring has the little ball bearing first off, and that ball bearing goes in the slot right over here by the Made in Japan insignia right on the lens right there. And it then goes up against these grooves in the lens on the focusing or on the aperture control ring here to make the clicking sound and lock the lens in specific positions. So that's the first thing that lines up here. So I'll just kind of slide this in place temporarily to show that lining up. And then you also want to make sure that on the aperture control ring there's this little notch over here. So there's the silver lever and then there's a little notch right over here. And that notch needs to line up with the larger gap in the ring we just installed down here. So it's going through the larger gap right down there. So considering those 2 things, first we'll put the little ball bearing in place here. Then we'll slide the aperture control ring over it, lining up that notch with the gap on the other side there. Make sure that when I turn it back and forth, got the clicking sound. Alright, so that's all lined up properly. And now we have this other ring, which is actually going to couple the aperture control ring into the diaphragm. So as I mentioned, the aperture control ring is going through the back of the lens and controlling the diaphragm with this little silver fork over on this side. So this center section here, the post on the outside is going to go into the little notch on the aperture control ring so that it rotates inside the lens along with the aperture control ring. And then this bar is going to go down inside that fork. So we can just line these up and push that down so that the entire ring is going down like that. And now when we rotate the aperture control ring back and forth, you should see the intersection and that little fork move back and forth with the aperture control ring. It's not actually going to move the diaphragm at the moment because the little black lever on this side is not being depressed of the diaphragm. But if we were to hold this down, then turning the aperture control ring should show that it correctly opens and closes the aperture, which it is. So to actually hold down the aperture control ring, we have these 2 little silver bars, one that's kind of rectangular and then one that has a little notch sticking out on the other side there. So first off, this one with the notch sticking out, it goes like this so that the end sticking out and actually getting hit is up on this side and is going to be hit first. And you can see that there are actually 4 different or 5 holes that this could possibly go into. My copy, it was just in the 2 inner ones, so the one second hole and then the fourth one here. I'm not sure why there are so many, but it does allow you, along with the size of the slots that this is going into, to actually adjust how the aperture is opening and closing. It just seems a little excessive to have this much range. And then the second little bar right here, this also goes into the two holes right over there. And that just stops it at the other end as well. You can also similarly adjust it because the slots that the screws are going into are very long. Okay, so now we should see that the aperture is limited in how far, the aperture control ring is limited in how far it can turn back and forth. And if it's not opening or closing fully, you can actually adjust these and how they fall within the different grooves here, or the slots that the screws are going into. Next up, we'll reinstall the back optic here. So this back optic just screws into place. You can lock it down with a spanning wrench in the two little holes on the outside there. And then now we have the mounting plate itself, and this is what's actually going to complete the coupling of the diaphragm to the lens body itself. So you can see that on the mounting plate here we have this big silver lever, and when I push it over to one side it automatically springs back open. And that is both coupled into the stop down lever, and it's also the mechanism that holds the aperture control ring or it holds the aperture open in its the correct state normally. So if you look in through the front of the lens, before we took a look at that black bar on the aperture, so it's going, this little silver lever is going to go on this side of the black bar and push over on it. So it's going to spring it open by default, and it's going to press up against it on this side. So we have to thread this on the back side of the lens up through so that it goes onto this side of the black bar here, so that it's always pressing up against it. So that when we turn the aperture control ring, this black bar is being pressed open, but when we hit the stop down lever, we release that pressure and the black bar springs back open on its own. So just looking in through the back here, and then through the front, get the silver bar on the correct side, and then make sure that this goes flush down, the mounting plate goes flush down onto the lens. That looks correct. And you can test it out at this stage to make sure that the coupling is correct as well. But we'll reattach the mounting plate with the 3 silver screws into the mount there. Okay, make sure that the aperture control ring is doing the correct thing here. That when we move that back and forth, that it's actually opening and closing the aperture. And then when we hit the stop down lever on the back of the lens too, it fully opens. Grab a mount here. So now all we have to do is reassemble the front of the lens, and there's only 2 steps here. One is installing the front optic, which just screws into place. And we'll lock it down with the spanning wrench in the 2 divots on either side here. Okay, and then finally reinstall the filter ring here, which also just screws into place on top of the front optic. Alright, so that has the entire lens reassembled there. As you can see, this is an incredibly easy lens to actually take apart and repair. With just a few steps, you can pretty much disassemble the entire thing. There aren't that many components. And you can also repair it pretty well as well. It uses cheaper components, especially on like the body sections. It's a cheaper material that it's using. So you do have to be a little bit careful not to damage or strip screws and things while you're working with this lens. But it really does provide easy access to things like the diaphragm, and it's a pretty simple setup mechanically internally. So even though this is a cheaper lens, it is one that is very repairable.